When we're starting out in photography, composition is a rather nebulous term. It can be difficult to determine what's a good photo and what's a not so good photo. And often it's the underlying geometry of the good photo that makes the difference. So in this video, we'll see what that's all about. Hi, Peter Charles here, Focus for Life Photography. And this video is going to be on composition, and I have put this video together to help people who are new to photography conquer a subject that can be rather nebulous. And when somebody says this is a great photo, look how well composed it is, and the beginner looks at the photo and goes, I can't see what they're looking at. What does it mean? What does composition mean? Why is this a good picture and why is that a bad picture? If you're having trouble telling the difference between good compositions and bad compositions, this video is for you. If you have trouble just simply composing a shot that people appreciate, this video is for you. So let's get into it and talk about how we're going to use geometry to get a better picture. I know I used the G word. Don't get scared. Don't run away. There's no math. There's no exams. I don't care if you flunked grade 9 math. We can do this. So first off, why bother with geometry? Well, the basic reason is it gives you a structure for your photo. You now have sort of a blueprint in your mind about what you're going to do if you think of it in geometric terms instead of just looking at somebody and going click, and then you get a picture back and the head is right in the middle of the image, which is a bad place to put the head, and you've chopped off the feet and things of this nature, the usual rookie mistakes. And when we look at how the masters painted their beautiful pictures from centuries ago, they used geometry. They would take a blank canvas, draw lines on it, and then paint over those lines. And it was those lines that gave the painting its structure and its underlying composition. In more modern terms, we started using a term called dynamic symmetry. So I'm only mentioning it because if you go looking for books, you'll see dynamic symmetry all over the place. We're not going to use it. I'm just mentioning it because it shows you how geometry is used to paint pictures. But unfortunately, it's not very useful for photographers because with dynamic symmetry, you can draw lines on a canvas. But what are you going to do for a photo? Put a glass plate in front of the subject and draw lines on the glass plate? That's not going to work. So, but there are a few elements of dynamic symmetry that we can put to use. So we'd kind of cherry pick a few things out of it to help us compose better pictures. So when we're getting into using geometry, the thing is, keep it simple for photography. You don't want to, overcomplicate it and, try to apply too much in the way of geometric technique to your photos, because then you're just confusing yourself. We're going to keep it simple in this video. And, as I say, what are the benefits? We say obviously better pictures, but are there more benefits than just better pictures? So let's take a look at a list of things. This is interesting. If we get better composition through geometry, we end up becoming more confident in our picture taking. We naturally see how we should compose. We have a structure. And I'm going to, take a look at my fly fishing background. When we introduce newcomers to fly fishing, I've done a lot of that kind of instruction. When you tell a beginner, that's a good presentation, that's a bad presentation, the beginner has no idea what you're talking about. Presentation is a nebulous word. Well, so is composition. And so you don't have confidence in your picture-taking ability because you don't really understand what composition is about. When you start using geometry in your composition, you gain confidence. And as a consequence, we also develop a muscle memory in our minds about what pictures should look like when we're applying good compositional rules. And I have some photos in here that illustrate, exactly how my muscle memory kicked in when I took the photo and why the photo was taken in the way it was. The other thing, too, is there's lots of good information out there on tips for composition. You can go on a website and they'll list 20 tips. Well, they're all right. They're all great tips. The problem is trying to remember them. Well, with geometry, you don't have to remember the tip because every tip you see on that website is based on geometry. So if you understand the geometry, the underlying work for that composition, what built that composition, you don't have to remember tips. You can just, take the picture because you understand what needs to be done because you understand the geometry. The other thing I find too is if you, I said before, as a beginner can't tell the difference in a good photo and a bad photo, now you begin to be able to see the difference between a good photo and a bad photo. And when you're selecting your own photos to print or to send to friends or put them up on social media, you'll have a much better idea of what constitutes a good photo. And you'll have more confidence in putting it up. The other thing too is, and I'll get more into depth with this, but we've all been exposed to geometry our entire lives. And so when you incorporate geometry into your photos, people have a natural familiarity with that and they will look at your photo with more interest because there's something familiar about the way it's put together. I'll use a music example for this. Let's say a band is writing a new album and they want to take their music in a bit of a different direction and they're worried about their fan base not being happy with it. What they can do with some of their songs is go back to some of their older music and use a few elements from their older music, so when a viewer is listening to that new music, they see and hear something from the past, something from a previous song that gives them some familiarity. And as a consequence, they are more accepting of the new music. So this whole thing of making your photo more familiar to people because they are seeing structures they're used to seeing is a big part of helping viewers find more interest in your photos. And you can explain what makes a photo right. And because that cycles back to confidence and is building your confidence. Every time you're able to do that, you're building your confidence in composition. So it becomes a very, very interesting element that when we build our confidence, we become so much more able to produce better images and better editing as well, I might add. So here's going to be the little bit of where we get into numbers. We're going to look at Fibonacci numbers and spirals, and these things are throughout the natural world. It's not like this is something artificial. And the people from centuries past, going right back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, had a feeling for this. And Fibonacci is a 13th century mathematician. He not only came up with this sequence, but he also was the person who introduced Indo-Arabic numerals to Western Europe. Because without those numerals, we wouldn't have the numbering system we have today. This is our numbering system. He was the one that introduced it to Europe. So we have a lot to be thankful to Fibonacci. So what are Fibonacci numbers and why do they apply to photography? Well, a Fibonacci number is basically you add the first two numbers and it sums up to the third number. So if I add 5 and 8 is equal to 13. If I add 34 and 55 is equal to 89. 89 and 144 is equal to 233. So you put those two numbers, add them together, it becomes the next number in the sequence. What that does is if you put it into a spiral like this, it creates a spiral. There's the 0 and the 1s and the 2 and the 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 34, and you get a spiral out of it. And it'll just keep going into infinity. What's interesting about Fibonacci numbers and spirals is they're throughout nature, all right? The petals, the number of petals on a flower is a Fibonacci number, right? The way a tree arranges its branches is based on Fibonacci numbers. The way the leaves are arranged on a branch are Fibonacci numbers. You've been living with Fibonacci numbers your entire life and didn't know it. The proportions of your hand: 2, 3, 5, 8. Fibonacci numbers. You'll find Fibonacci numbers in outer space, in galaxies. I mean, it's everywhere. And that's where I said about being familiar. People instinctively understand these things without being conscious of it. And that's where we get into, looking at where the spiral patterns are. The famous one is the nautilus shell, if you've ever seen a picture of a nautilus shell. But pineapples, sunflowers, pine cones, the human ear, it's a Fibonacci spiral. You know, you've been looking at one, you're on other people, you can see your own ears, but you're looking at other people's ears, you're seeing Fibonacci spirals. When you look into the night sky, you know, pictures of the night sky, and there's a spiral arm galaxy, and we live in a spiral arm galaxy, that's a Fibonacci spiral. It's everywhere. That's what I'm saying, is this geometry is so familiar to us, we see it every day and we don't even realize it. We're looking at Fibonacci spirals, and then when you apply them to your photographs, that's when that familiarity kicks in, and people instinctively understand it without knowing you've used a spiral. So it's just a matter of opening up your mind to the fact that these things exist. So what we're going to do is look at some examples from my own work where I have incorporated Fibonacci spirals and other tools, what we call rule of thirds, diagonals, and triangles. We'll look at all of that and how it works into photography, and not only in our picture taking, but also in our editing, because I'm going to get in here and do some editing as well to show how these things work. And here is my first example. This fellow here, this was originally a landscape, and I did not like it as a landscape. It's a street photo. You have to grab what you can get in street photography, if you've ever done it. You don't always have all day to compose the picture. You've got to get the picture, then work with it afterwards. So I turned it into a portrait, and when I did, I made sure the spiral worked with its face, and you can see it goes right through, underneath the sign, down by the guy reading the paper, and out through his feet. Perfect. You know, and that was done in editing. That wasn't done in the viewfinder. So you can use these tools both ways. You can take a picture that's not great, like that one, turn it into something good, or you take this one. This one was composed in the viewfinder, got it close, not quite, wasn't real happy with the composition, but it wasn't bad. And all I really did was pull down the corners to lessen the amount of sky, and the spiral dropped in, and you can see it just flows beautifully, you know, around the woman in a hat, up, and you can see how the spiral is echoed in the chain and in the dog leash. I mean, it's quite interesting how that spiral, you know, tends to flow through the photo once you start thinking in those terms. Let's take a look at another one. Now, what's interesting about this photo, I took it about 7 years ago, and I was using slightly too wide an angle of lens for the situation, so when I got it home, I cropped it, turned it into black and white, and when I was going to put this video together, I started going through my photos, picked this one out, I just dropped the spiral on it, and it was bang on. So even though I wasn't using this kind of tool, because I didn't have it back then, I still hit this bang on with the spiral. What's great about this is, look, the spiral just comes around her necklace, and we go through the buildings behind her, and up into her, and she's going into her shop, and up here, and her gaze is going right to where the spiral leaves the frame. You know, you can't ask for better than that. I mean, it just worked perfectly. And as I say, that was done without any tools. I just cropped it. That's where it felt it should go. Here's my one color picture in this. It's a nature picture. Obviously, if taking pictures of nature, and I'm talking about this being the geometry of the natural world, you might as well put a nature picture in, right? You can see how, you know, the spiral starts with the V and follows quite nicely the shape of the flower, and goes out the bottom end. Now, if I was to improve this photo, I'd take out that fuzzball at the bottom, but I left it the way it was taken. This is just a bit of cropping to reduce the overall size. That's it. I just wanted to, you know, come in a little tighter on the B. Now, this particular photo, what's interesting about this one is I wasn't happy with it when I took it. This is full frame right from the viewfinder. I haven't cropped anything at all. And it wasn't working for me, and I could not put my finger on what the problem was. And I started to think about it when I started putting photos together for this video. I thought, you know what, that'll be a good example of how we can fix something. So it's close, but it's not quite there. So what I did was I applied the spiral by just pulling up the bottom corner, where the red arrow is. All I did was drag that up tighten it up, and look at how the spiral dropped into place from her face around her hair, down through her arm, out through her hand, and out the end. And again, she's looking exactly where the spiral leaves the frame. I mean, it's practically a textbook example of how that spiral works. And when we look at the final cropped image, it is much better than the previous one. I much prefer this to what I had before, and there's the two of them put together. The uncropped is on top and the cropped is at the bottom. And it becomes a much more pleasing image because the proportions are now correct. The proportions on the top one were not correct, and it shows. Now, if you're having trouble figuring out which one you would like, that's an example of how geometry helps. This one I almost got it right. This is, again, another model. It's a club shoot, so we're rushing a little bit because we've got other photographers who want their turn, so you can't spend all your time with the model and leave them cooling their heels. So a little bit of a rushed composition, so I didn't get it quite right. And we can see when we apply the spiral that I'm a little bit off, but not much. But it does leave the picture a little bit odd. It doesn't quite work. And when I just made a very, very slight crop, pulling in the top corner, you see the red arrow there, I just pulled it in, nailed the spiral, and now you can see it wraps around her head, follows the outline of her arm, and then sort of follows that graffiti, I think it was, and out the top of the image. Again, you get a very natural flow through the image when you look at it. And it greatly improved the image. You can see with the crop applied, it comes out with a better image, better composition, and you see the two together. You can see the bottom one just has a better appearance. And it's just a little minor crop just pulled down to the top. So that's how you can use it in your editing to take an image that wasn't that great. Now we're going on to rule of thirds, diagonals, and triangles. And don't worry, we're not going to be using that thing. I'm just using that as an example of what dynamic symmetry looks like and why it's not practical for photography. But we will be using a little bit of that, and you'll see how we use either rules of thirds, lines, diagonals, triangles to try and either resurrect a photo that in editing or to take the photo. All right, this one again was one of our club shoots. It's a model at the piano. This is straight out of the viewfinder. This is exactly how I took the shot. I've just converted it to black and white. So we're going to look at how diagonals work on this particular photo. And the first one we're going to look at is called the Baroque angle, or the Baroque diagonal. And it's based on our writing system, which goes from left to right. And that's how we write and how we read. And so the assumption is a person's eye will start at the bottom and go up through the frame as we see it here, as we see that red diagonal. And that's considered a pleasing diagonal because it's comfortable for us because of our writing system. There's another diagonal they use called a sinister diagonal, and it's the opposite because it goes in the opposite direction of our writing system. It's not considered to be a pleasing diagonal. In fact, it's a way of making something look threatening if you use it, or dark, or mysterious, or you want one of the more negative type of connotation for your image. You might want to put things on a sinister diagonal. That's the theory anyway. Of course, if you're from a culture that uses a writing system going from right to left, then this is reversed. So it is a culturally oriented technique. And so somebody who's used to writing in Arabic, for example, might find what we call the sinister diagonal to be the good one. It's interesting how culture plays a part in a lot of our compositions and how we do things. So there I have the same photo flipped, and see if you can see a difference between the two. Let's get rid of the red lines. Here's a test. Copy paste that bit, do a frame capture, put it up on your computer screen, and ask non-photographers what they see in difference between the two photos. And what's interesting is the sinister diagonal, which is the one on the right, her face seems to be darker. And it isn't. It's the same photo flipped, but it's just the way we're seeing it. I asked a non-photographer exactly these questions. You know, is it the same photo? Do you see any difference? And they were saying, telling me all sorts of differences between the photos. It's exactly. I kept saying it's the same photo flipped. Well, yeah, but the other one's got this and that. So just changing from a baroque to a sinister diagonal changes how people perceive the photo. It's very interesting that how brain gets wired by our writing system and other cultural habits that we have, and it affects the way we view an image. Here's the example of the diagonals in that photo, and it's referred to as a gamut of the diagonals, all of them, in other words. And you can see the baroque diagonal going through the middle of it, and most of the diagonals in that photo line up with the baroque diagonal. A few of them don't, a few of them go in the opposite direction. But when you were looking at using diagonals in a photo, the suggestion is no more than 5 to 7, and if you can use less, that's great. In this case, I've only used 4. And 2 of them aren't really meaningful. The window and the piano, they're not adding much, they're out of focus. So it's really on the model, and most of the diagonals are just going in 2 directions. So it has, that composition holds together because of the how we put it, the simplicity of the diagonals in being used, I should say. Now I flipped it. We talked about flipping before. If I was going to actually, print that and say put it into a competition or something like that, I would use that orientation. I think the sinister diagonal goes with her expression, which is like, why are you bothering me? What's your problem? Leave me alone, I'm playing my piano. And I think because of that, in the sinister diagonal, this particular image really, really works quite well. And I think it ticks a lot of the compositional boxes. Okay, here's a case where I had a street photo that I didn't like. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to put a bad one up, and let's play with the bad one. And I thought, well, there's lots of geometry going on in this picture with all that concrete. What can I do with it? And when I started trying to put triangles to it, wasn't working. Now you can see this, the spiral sort of worked, but it's not a type of photo that is appealing to that kind of approach, because all those sharp edges and all those straight lines. So it's more diagonals and triangles that are going to be in play when we try to analyze this. And the triangles are not working. So I played around with it, and there's the baroque diagonal and there's a triangle. Again, it's not working. So I gave up on the 3x2 format and went to square. It's not perfect, but you can see it's starting to come together. So that's something else you might want to consider when you're doing your editing, is don't get stuck in the format that the camera offers you. Most cameras are 3x2, some of them are 4x3. Whatever, your format that you're working with, be prepared to change it. Be prepared to go from landscape to portrait and back. Go to square in this case. And sometimes a photo will come together when you change the format. So this one, again, is another photo that is full, uncropped, exactly as I shot it. And the only thing I did here was converted black and white. So we're going to look at applying rule of thirds to this image and see what it does for us. Now, rule of thirds is simply dividing the image up in threes, like dividing it threes this way and dividing it threes this way by using 4 lines. So you have a rectangle. Each rectangle is the same proportions as the image itself. And as you can see here, this line goes all the way through the model. And these intersection points are called nodes, and that is considered points of interest. This is an example of how it can work for you, and also an example of how you can make a mistake with the rule of thirds, because a lot of people don't like this technique. They think it gets overused, and they've got a point. So here I've put the interest points on her shoulder and on her hand. A lot of people would put it on her face. So they put her face down around here. You could probably get a picture out of that, but I didn't do that. I put her head way at the top of the frame. which a lot of portrait people would never do if you're working with rule of thirds. But as you can see, the rule of thirds still works on this image, despite her face being right up at the top of the frame. Instead, I'm using her shoulder, which is a very bright point in the image, and her hand. So let's go on and see what happens when I apply the sinister diagonal to the picture. And it goes right through her shoulder, right down her arm, out to the point of the elbow. You know, bang on, that geometry is bang on. Again, this is what I've said before about familiarity. This is the kind of thing that people are used to seeing in the natural world, these kinds of geometric layouts without even really realizing it. And so when they see it in a photo, it becomes something familiar to them. And that's exactly what's going on here. And especially when I look at a second diagonal here, I'll look at another one going right through eye, nose, out the hand. These diagonals, if you notice, they're being drawn from the corner through one of these nodes. So the Baroque goes, or I should say the sinister diagonal goes all the way through both nodes. It does that automatically, by the way. When you use rule of thirds, your diagonal, your sinister and your Baroque diagonal will go through the nodes. So in this case, I've only taken this through one node, and you can see eye, nose, hand. Perfect lineup. So this is an example of me taking a picture and having that muscle memory of geometry, and I took this shot. And it really, I mean, I only got, I think, 2 or 3 shots of this model in this situation, again, because I've got other photographers waiting their turn. So it's like, get the shot quickly and move on. And this is what it turned out like. And again, that's just because I'm letting that muscle memory of, you know, geometry work for me. Now, here's an example where I had to do a lot of work on a photo, because I was in a coffee shop. I was in a line that was moving very slowly, and there's a lot of people. I didn't want to step out of the line to get this shot. So I took a couple of shots from where I was standing in the lineup, and you know, they were a landscape. They were crooked. There's 2 shots, and they were awful. But I figured, you know what, I can work with this. So I straightened it, cropped it into a vertical, and we ended up with this great shot. And you can see how all these diagonals are working perfectly. And this one going, you know, straight down her gaze. This one level with the countertop, you know, the triangle where her face is. And this diagonal, these 2 working on her leg and the shape of her body and the way she's sitting. You know, I've darken this one up for dramatic effect, but when it was a little lighter, when all this area was a little lighter, you could see the outline were close, how way these diagonals all drop through. So here's an example where I straightened what we call straightening horizon in order to get this picture, the window frame straight up and down, and the table straight across. And because the original was crooked, because I took it quickly. Plus I was desperate need for a cup of coffee. So here's, we're going to go to the same problem. It was a street photo again. I have 2 crops of this that I like. I have 2 different variations of it. But it was a landscape, and there was some busyness off to the right-hand side of the photo, right-hand side of her, left-hand side of the photo, I should say. And I didn't like that I cut off. But the rest of the image is basically as is. And it's tilted. You can see by the window frame again, the tilted horizon. And I left the tilt in. And when I left the tilt in, it retained the geometry. If I took the tilt out, I would lose the geometry. Look at this one. This goes from the corner through the node, right up her nose, right through the part of her hair, down her back. This one going through the hand, down one leg to her foot. This one going through a hand, down the other leg to a foot. How that geometry lines up perfectly. But if I straightened it, that's gone. So the bottom line with these 2 photos is unless it's necessary for the image to make sense, don't automatically straighten them up. Look at the geometry, how it holds together. In one case, I had to straighten the geometry, and in the other one, I left it crooked. And they both work. So my bottom line is, don't try to make everything dead straight and perfectly level. It's not always necessary and doesn't always work. Okay, let's take a look at some tools that are available to us. First off, we're going to look at the viewfinders in our camera. I can turn the grid on, and there's 3 grids in my cameras, rule of thirds plus 2 others that offer more options, more grids, more squares I should say, or rectangles. Also, I have the green horizon line, which I can turn on, so I know whether I'm crooked or not. These are good to turn on when you're learning composition. But once you've started to get a feel for composition, turn them off. I don't have them on. I've just turned them on for the purpose of this video. What I find is that if you have them on, you try to make everything fit with the horizon and with the rule of thirds. And that's not always good, as we saw in some of my photos. It's not always great to have that rule of thirds, hammered in place on your photo. It's better sometimes to go with a different composition, where you're using the spiral or whatever your technique you want to use, diagonals, whatever. It may not fit the rule of thirds, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to make everything fit the rule of thirds. But it's handy to have this turned on in your camera when you're starting out. Now we'll look at some software tools, and this is in Infinity Photo. This is the image which you saw earlier, and when you use the crop tool in Infinity Photo, you have the option of using overlays, so you can crop according to rule of thirds, spirals, and that. So we'll see some of the overlays. The first one is rule of thirds, and you can see it doesn't work for that photo. And that's what I'm saying, is that you don't always apply rule of thirds to every photo. Here we've got diagonals. Kind of works a little bit, but still not great for that photo. And then the lastly is the spiral, and oh boy, does it ever work. It drops right into place. So when you're doing a cropping in Infinity Photo 2, you can choose the overlay and adjust the image to get the composition you want. Very, very handy. And I don't use it very often, but when I do, I'm glad I have it. So there's a bottom line here, is that when you're starting out in photography and you are trying to learn composition, you need a basis. You need a foundation to do it with. And you can get books like this, Painter's Secret Geometry. You can look at the masters. I really do recommend embracing it, embedding yourself in the composition of great painters and great photographers. Just look through these books. It soaks into your mind, starts baking into your mind this geometry. Look for the geometry in the photos. Look for the geometry in the paintings. Get to see how the painter or how the photographer used these compositional aids, the rule of thirds or the diagonals or whatever it was that they happened to use. And it'll help build that information in your mind, so you'll do what I did with that model at the bars. Is just, I had less than a minute, had her pose at the bars, took 2 or 3 shots, nailed the composition. And it's only possible to do that when you have immersed yourself in it. So you're not trying to memorize anything. That's the important thing about this. You're not trying to memorize a list of tips. You're just getting used to the idea that good composition has a geometric foundation. And if you start to get used to that natural geometry that you've lived with all your entire life, you got a Fibonacci spiral in your ear, you got Fibonacci numbers in the bones of your hand. You've been living with this geometry your entire life. So start using it in your photos, and you'd be surprised how quickly you pick this up. This is not, or it doesn't require any special talents. You just have to start thinking about it, and you begin to see it. And as soon as you start to see it, you'll be able to use it in your photos. So give that a try. Cheers.